Kevin Connor. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Fourandsix Technologies, and we're a company working on software to detect when images have been manipulated, and I'm at Luminance 2012. One of the things that we need to work on in the next few years is figuring out how to give people more of a sense of how to know what's real and what's not real in photography. Obviously, there's a place for manipulation, but people have become too distrustful of all photographs that they see, and we need objective ways of assessing what's real and what's not.
Thank you. So I'm actually the first speaker of the very first day of the very first Luminance conference. So I figure it's probably a good idea to start with a slide that actually represents the span of photography from the early days through today. But this is probably it's sort of an unusual pairing of photographs for a slide, I would say. Very different subject matter that we're looking at here. But the reason I have these two photographs is they do illustrate a change that's happened in the attitude towards photography in the past 100 years or so. The image that you see on the left is a fairly famous photograph. It's known as the Cottingley Fairies. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it's basically the result of two young girls, two cousins, who decided to borrow their father's camera and photograph themselves with a bunch of cardboard cutouts of illustrations of fairies from a children's book. And these photos wound up getting a lot of attention, and many people took these photos as proof of the existence of fairies, which is really pretty incredible, because you can look at this photo. I mean, those don't even look like real fairies of any kind, if there is such a thing as a real fairy. They pretty clearly look like little cutouts, and yet people were in a sense gullible enough to believe that these could be real. And I would say that part of that is that photography at that time, as a fairly new medium, was seen as something that represented reality. So people were ready to suspend their disbelief a little bit more when they saw something represented in a photograph. And now we fast forward to the present, and you look at the second image up there from 2011. Now this is a news photograph that was published by Reuters last year, and it actually appeared on their homepage as a photo of the day. And it depicts someone in Libya with an RPG launcher on their shoulder as they're firing. And the interesting with this photo is, as soon as it appeared on their page, a mini controversy erupted, because many commenters online said that that couldn't possibly be a real photograph. That, oh, well, the photographer would have been burned up if he was really there. There's no way that person could have balanced that with a crutch, and he would have been fallen over. The shadows are wrong. They went on about how this wasn't a real photograph. And it was, in fact, a real photograph. And I think the interesting thing is the level of distrust that this photo found. And I think one of the reasons is that now when we look at photographs, we tend to evaluate them in terms of our own experience. Either we want to have seen that same situation in our own real life, or we want to have seen many photographs like that before. And if you see something that's truly novel that you've never seen before, this was a very unusual shot in terms of the moment in time and the perspective in which this was captured. So if you see something that you've never seen before, you become distrustful right off the bat. You think, oh, that's not right. And I think as a photographer, that probably should be concerning, because as a photographer, you're aiming to capture that photo that nobody's ever captured before. And yet the minute you do that, you're going to be greeted with some suspicion, because people will say, that doesn't look right. So it's sort of a little bit ironic and a little sad in a way. I was actually just last week reading an article on the Pointer website, and it was an interview with someone from National Geographic who was judging photos for one of their photo competitions. And sure enough, he was saying that when they're looking for fraud in the photos, photos have been over-manipulated, the first thing they look for is for something that seems a little too perfect. Then they're going to become suspicious and start checking into it a little bit more and make sure it's real. So, again, if the more novel, the more perfect it is, the more likely someone's going to become suspicious. Now, the thing is that, that's one implication of this distrust of photographs, but the issue can actually be much more serious than that. There's really legal consequences here, and a variety of other things. I think in particular in the US, one of the issues is around child pornography, because several years ago, I think it was in 2002, there was a Supreme Court ruling that said that because of free speech, you could actually distribute something that looked like child pornography as long as it didn't involve the participation of actual children. So if it was a 3D rendering, or if you took a photograph of an adult and manipulated it to look more childlike, that's all legal. And so that became a common defense in court, is for someone to say, oh, this isn't a real child, I just manipulated this. And it can be a very effective defense because of that distrust, because people think, well, I can't really trust what I see in a photo anyway, so maybe that's true, maybe that's not a child. And of course, there's issues for scientific research and other things as well. Any place where photos are used, there is the potential for people to distrust them. So the amazing thing, though, is with all this distrust, there's still so many images that are manipulated that get through and then get accepted. So this image up here is an example from this year where someone posted a tornado photo on their Facebook page. And they said, oh, look at this tornado I saw in my backyard. It started spreading virally on Facebook, and then someone else took that photo and they then posted it on the Facebook page of a local television station, and that television station saw it and it made it on the TV news. And sure enough, this was a fake photo. The person who initially posted it on their own Facebook page later apologized, and I don't think they ever expected it to reach that level where it wound up on the news. And you can look at this pretty clearly. I mean, if you see it closely, that it's very obviously manipulated. You can see the halo around where the funnel cloud was inserted in there. And there's other examples as well. There's this example from last year, I guess it was, when the hurricane passed by Puerto Rico. This photo started circulating online purporting to be a shark that was swimming through a street in Puerto Rico that had flooded. And this also made it onto the news on several news stations. And later on, someone identified that that shark was actually lifted out of this other photo from Africa Geographic. So of course, it was a doctored photo, but people had accepted this as reality. And then, there are more serious examples as well. This one here is one that probably many of you are familiar with, back from the 2004 election, where there was a photograph showing John Kerry and Jane Fonda together at a protest of the Vietnam War, and it later turned out that they had never been together at that protest, and this was manipulated to look like an historical artifact. And even though it was fake, it still did have an impact on the election. So, so this can be a serious issue. There's a similar example happened just recently, certainly not at that level, but there was a photo circulating from the Republican National Convention that showed the debt clock right above a sign that says, "We built that," from the convention. And of course, those two things were not actually together at the convention, but someone manipulated them to look like they were. So the question is, why with all the suspicion, can so many of these things slip by us? And the reason is because we're really bad at detecting these things. And our visual system is not really evolved for finding problems with 2D photographs. And really, our visual system is very effective at interpreting our natural environment, of interpreting faces and recognizing faces, of navigating the world around us. But when it comes to photographs, we can often miss things. So as you're looking at this photograph up here, which of course is upside down, you see my face there, but you may not immediately recognize that this is me before my plastic surgery. So, of course, what I did here is I flipped around the mouth and the eyes. And the reason this gets by is there's actually a portion of our brain that is focused on recognizing faces. And so we have very efficient ways of processing faces. And we see the pieces of the face, and we recognize them and say, okay, that's fine. I see the face there. I recognize that face. But we're not really processing it in an accurate way. We're processing it in an efficient way. There's some other examples here showing how we can be thrown off by perspective cues. This is a very rough drawing here, obviously. It's not a very effective drawing of perspective, and yet it still creates certain assumptions for us about these two tables. And there's a study that was done with this particular illustration. It was shown to a variety of people, and they were asked, are these two tabletops in 2D space, are those the same size or different sizes? Which one's bigger or smaller? And typically people would say that those were two different sizes. But the fact is, I can draw an outline around one of those, and if we rotate that and shift it over to the side, you'll see that they actually are identical. So the cues that are in this illustration, as crude as they are, they're enough to throw off our perceptions of that shape in there. Now, I'll show you one more example. This may be one that you've seen before as well. This is a very fairly simple 3D rendering, and you see those two squares labeled A and B. And again, if people were asked, which one of these is lighter or darker, or are they the same, people typically will say that A is definitely darker than B. And yet, if you isolate those two and look at the actual shades, they're actually about the same. And the reason, of course, is because of the other visual cues in this photograph that throw off our perception. And there are cues that work very well in our natural environment, but depending on what we're trying to perceive, they potentially can throw us off. So the problem, of course, is that for starters, we don't feel like we can totally trust photographs anymore because they can be manipulated so easily. And yet we can't really trust our eyes either. So it's not very effective to just have this general distrust and not an easy way to focus it. So what you need is a much more systematic approach to looking at images and understanding how to pick apart what's true and what's not. And one way to approach that is to think of what I like to call the 3 Fs. And the Fs stand for the file, the footprints, and flaws. And I'm going to explain what each one of these things are. So let's start with the file. So by file, I mean the packaging, how the file is. I'm not looking at the image itself at this point, but we're just concerned with the file format and how it's wrapped up. A simple example is if you saw a PSD file, well, that's the Photoshop native format. So chances are that file came out of Photoshop. So it was probably manipulated in some way. You don't know how much it was manipulated, but at least it's probably more manipulated than a proprietary RAW format from a digital camera, because those are very hard to replicate. And once you edit them, you typically have to change them into a different format. Obviously, metadata can be very useful for understanding what may have happened to an image. You can see some aspects of an editing history within the metadata, and there's a variety of things beyond that. But one of the things that's particularly useful is looking at JPEG files, because there's actually a huge variety in how JPEG files can be saved. So if I look at a typical camera, let's say it has 3 JPEG settings, 3 compression settings from low quality, medium quality, and high quality, right? So you've got those 3 settings there, and you compare that to Photoshop. Photoshop, if I were to save out using the Save for Web dialog, there's a slider there that goes from 1 to 100. So you have 100 different compression settings. And in fact, there aren't necessarily any of those 100 different settings that correspond to the same parameters used in that camera's 3 settings. Because the reality is that in the total universe of parameters that can be fed into the JPEG compression process, it's a very large number of possibilities. And there's no standards of what exactly is the best low quality setting or high quality setting. Every manufacturer can do their own thing, and they do their own thing. And the result of that is that the choices they make tend to be very distinctive. And so I can see a file from a particular Canon camera may have certain JPEG settings that were used that can be seen in the file, and they'll be different from even another Canon camera, a Nikon camera, from Photoshop and software. So if you start looking at this and saying, okay, I've got this file, it says it came out of my Canon S100, and yet the compression setting used doesn't match what comes out of the Canon S100. It matches what Photoshop does. Again, you have an indication that that file was touched. You don't know what was done to it, but you know a little bit more than you knew at the outset. So those are some examples of looking at things about the file. Now I'm going to get into footprints. So when I say footprints, I'm talking about how every tool that you use when manipulating a photo is going to leave certain traces behind. And those traces, they may be subtle or they may be more obvious. And of course, in how subtle or obvious they are depends on the skill of the person using the tool to some extent. Now, of course, this photo is another notorious photo that many of you have probably seen before. This was another photo from Reuters from Adnan Haj. And this was in Lebanon, and you can see that smoke. Shortly after this photo came out, a number of people pointed out that there was a repeating pattern in the sky of that smoke. And they said that's a telltale sign of cloning. So this image was manipulated. And sure enough, if we come to the original photo, you can see it doesn't have that repeating pattern in it. So that's a very obvious example of footprints, where the clone tool will leave some repetition. And now, there may be repetition from the clone tool that's much more subtle than that, but if you have tools that sort of start examining the image and finding where pixels repeat, then that can be useful. Another example, as I was saying, every tool may leave a different trace behind. So in this case, this is a scientific image. And what sometimes people do for scientific papers, when there's fraud there, they may start manipulating their images to support their study a little bit better. And so one of the things you might want to look for is whether things have been deleted. Well, when you erase something and you're trying to basically take a detail out and replace it with a black background, typically people use pure black. But real shadows are not pure black. They have subtle detail in them. So if you adjust the levels, then you can often find where the image was manipulated. And sure enough, you see that as I manipulate the levels, that area that is pure black in the middle is the area that was manipulated. So there was some detail that was removed from this. So that's a little bit about the first two, the file and the footprints. Now, when I say flaws, what I'm talking about here are mistakes. When people have tried to duplicate reality in some way and they haven't gotten it right. Now, this example up here is a very terrible example. I found this up on Photoshop Disasters. Clearly, some art director thought that the person who was standing on one side of the photo would look better in the middle, so they moved them in the middle but didn't worry too much about that extra elbow that was there. Most of the time, these flaws are much more subtle than that. And I think the best rule of these photo flaws is that if it's something that's hard to spot, it's also something that's hard to get right. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. A great example of this is anything having to do with lighting, talking about shadows and reflections and so forth. People have a hard time detecting what's wrong with this. And if they can't detect what's wrong, then when they're editing the file and trying to eyeball things to make them look correct, they're going to tend to mess up. So one example here is reflections. This was a study done by a co-founder in my company, and they showed people images of reflections, and many of these reflections were wrong, and people were only able to identify the wrong reflections about 55.7% of the time, which is just slightly better than chance at 50%. Similar thing with shadows, when people were shown shadows that were incorrect for an image. Now, they were better if the shadows went in opposite directions. People could spot that most of the time. But when shadows were in the vicinity of being correct, then people, again, it was about chance, 52.8%, so they might as well be guessing. But there are actually ways that you can, if you apply a little bit of analysis to the photo, that you can actually see whether the shadows are correct or not. So this is a very simple technique. The simple fact is that with a shadow, it's basically light hits an object and it creates that shadow on the floor. So you can draw a line from any point on the object to the corresponding point on the shadow and extend that line, and it'll eventually hit the light source. And if we're outside, that light source is very far away and the lines are just about parallel. But when you photograph parallel lines in perspective, those parallel lines are going to converge, just like train tracks converge when you shoot them, going off towards the horizon. And that means that all the shadow lines in a photo that come from the same light source will intersect at the same point. And if they don't, either that means you have multiple light sources or someone has messed up the shadows. Now here's an example where we've taken the lines on all the identifiable points on these objects, connected them to the shadows, and you can see, of course, they all lead right to the light source. And now in this case, the light source is in the frame of the photo, but even if it wasn't, even if this photo was cropped, you could extend those lines outside the frame and see where they intersect. Now here's a slightly different photo. You can see one of those shadows has changed, and sure enough, as we draw the intersection lines, you can see which object was inserted or manipulated from that photo. So this is a very effective technique, very easy to do. There's actually something similar you can do with reflections. I don't have time to get into that, but if you basically draw lines from an object to the point of that object in the reflection, all of those lines should intersect as well. And if you actually go to our website, you can read a little bit more about why that's true. So the goal of all of this is how do we get rid of this sort of vague kind of distrust and replace it with a more objective measure so that you're not just distrusting all these photos, but you can actually take a look and more intelligently decide which things can be trusted, which things can't. And that's really what our company is focused on. We're actually going to be announcing our first product very shortly. But if you go to our website, you'll find we actually have a blog where we discuss some of these techniques. You can learn more about that. There's also an interesting gallery up there that goes through all of the manipulated photos from like the 1800s through to the present. So it's sort of interesting to see how those have changed over time. So anyway, that gives you an overview. Again, that's really those three things to look for: the files, the footprints, and the flaws. And you can get from that a better understanding of what's real and what's not. Thank you.
Hey, Kevin. So I actually thought that the debt number and we built that was a real photo. And I know that you guys have talked to major news organizations about trying to detect manipulation in photos. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in regards to so much of modern propaganda goes through social media channels. Is there a way through like a Facebook or an Instagram that we can not have to go to Snopes to realize that something was debunked and fake? Is there a way that you envision that being detectable?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, we've actually had some discussions about that, about, there are things we can do with social media to make it, so you can instantly know whether something's true or not. And I think we're a little bit of a ways off from that. I mean, for instance, some of the stuff with detecting whether a file is original or not can be useful. But that is, the problem with a lot of these techniques, it's not like push button simple at this point. You have to be a detective and look at a variety of different things. And so what we're trying to do right now is just make tools that make that detective work easier. But we're not quite at the point where we have like that one push button thing that's going to tell you everything you need to know about the image. But hopefully we can get closer to that point over time.
Great. Kevin O'Connor, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.